Hey everybody. Hey, I'm back to talk on a new topic. This one is on cooling systems. I had a question of someone who's got a problem with their Camaro where it's running hot, and the question was what to do with it. What to do about it. Sounded like a great topic, and I'll say is, over the years, not just Camaros, my Mustangs, Oldsmobiles, I've had cooling issues in a lot of different cars over the years, especially if you have one that's older. There are a lot of things that you have to go through, or sometimes that you have to check out. Let me dig in a little bit, and we'll go through a few things. First off, I'm going to start with a safety message, okay? Before you start messing with cooling systems, never take off the radiator cap when the engine is hot. Never remove the cap when the engine is hot. And I know a bunch of people are going to go, oh, it's okay, I can, whatever. Don't do it. Especially if you don't know how hot the engine is to begin with. But here's the point. These cooling systems of Camaro, any of these that are running, typically what you run is 50-50 ethylene glycol and water. The boiling point of that with a 15-pound cap is around 264 or 5 degrees, give or take. And most of us aren't exactly precise, over time. Your mix might be a little more, that might be 55%, might be 50% or 45%. But consider it that you got a 50% mix. Your boiling point with a 15-pound cap is around 265, maybe only 260, somewhere in that neighborhood, right? Without any pressure on it, without a pressure cap, that cooling system, that coolant will boil at about 220, 223. Well, hey, this Camaro's fan doesn't come on until about 220. So if your engine is hot and has been running, if you go take that pressure cap off, you twist it and you release the pressure, if you're above the boiling point, the entire cooling system will dump. And I mean dump. And if you don't believe me, go back and look at my break-in video where I did the second time around, where I did the cam break-in. And I got it hot, and it was beginning to boil, but it wasn't boiling. But the pressure pushed the lower hose off. And so the system went to atmosphere, and we had coolant everywhere. It was a mess. I had a terrible time cooling it down, and fortunately I got my wife, I knew things were going bad, and I got my wife to back up because she was trying to get in with the video camera and get a closer look. I'm telling you, don't pull the cap, because if it boils, it'll hurt you, and you just don't want to do it. Please. So as we're delving in to cooling systems, I'm going to refer to the service manuals and standard information, but let's start from a general principle. If you've got a car that's overheating, that's one area. If you have one that's leaking and you're losing coolant, that's a little bit different. I'm going to try to focus right now on the overheating portion, but think about how the system operates, right? You've got your engine has combustion, flame in the combustion chambers, right? So you've got high temperatures. That heat goes into the castings, either whether it's into the cylinder, some of it goes in the cylinder head, some of it goes into the block, some of it goes out into the exhaust manifolds and out to the exhaust. And in order to keep the engine metals at the right temperature, you cool them with either water or with oil. In these engines, like my V8, it's oil by splash that gets up onto cylinder walls, it gets up onto the bottom of the piston, and you transfer heat into the oil, which then ends up going, you'll have airflow over the oil pan, so you'll lose some heat there. There's a big heat balance. Those things, unless you add an oil cooler, those things are kind of fixed. You send a certain amount of air out the exhaust, you send a certain amount of heat to oil, the rest of it goes through your coolant. Heat goes into the water jacket through the metal. You heat the metal. The heat from the metal needs to flow into the water, or ethylene glycol and water mixture, into your coolant. You need to circulate that coolant with a pump. That hot coolant needs to get out through a thermostat, which regulates engine temperature, out to your radiator, and you flow through the tubes of the radiator. The heat transfers from the tubes into the fins, and from the fins into the air. So as you're trying to cool your engine, now we'll flip the other way and start from the outside. You have air flowing into the radiator. So basic thought processes. One, can the air get to the fins? Are the fins clean? Is there anything obstructing your radiator? Are your air dams and so forth, deflectors, fan shrouds, are those things all in place so you get the right amount of air through the radiator? Is your radiator clean? If you have deposits in the radiator, in the tubes, for example, or obstructions in the tubes, if you can't get the heat out to the tubes and the fins, again, you'll end up with hot coolant flowing through the radiator. It won't cool, it'll still be hot, and it'll go back into the engine hot. You could have a problem with the water pump, and if the water pump isn't properly circulating coolant, if you don't have enough flow, then again, things will be too hot. Your system is regulated by a thermostat. The thermostat is basically intended to let the engine warm up to a certain point, and then it will open and it will regulate flow to keep that engine close to its normal temperature. Although as things get hotter, the thermostat will be full open, and your cooling system, your car can run a lot hotter. In the industry, if you were running in severe conditions like out in the desert at above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and pulling up a mountain, and maybe even pulling a load, the system is allowed to go to 260 degrees or so, and that wouldn't be unexpected for transients. You wouldn't want to run there all day. But anyway, a thermostat's supposed to regulate you near normal operating. If you're inside the engine block, what you have to worry about is, can I get the heat from the cylinder walls and the cylinder head? Can I get the heat out of the metal of the engine, cylinder heads and engine block and cylinder walls? Can I get that into the coolant? And if your cooling system, if you have scale from hard water, for example, or from rust, especially as cars get older, if you have deposits up inside the cylinder walls and inside the cylinder head that cause what I call thermal resistance, and you can't get the heat into the water because there's something blocking it, that's a problem. And sometimes those can be cured by chemical flush, for example. And I've used some of those. You can buy certain ones right now which are mostly citric acid and drive them for several hundred miles and clean deposits. In a previous video I discussed making sure that you pull the drains, remove the drains plugs in the block, presuming your block has them, but the V8s all seem to, and make sure that you don't have an accumulation of sediment. The block, I'll use in V8s, right? The block is a V. If it was an inline, it wouldn't matter. Inline vertical cylinder walls. But down at the bottom of the block, around the cylinders, you have areas where sediments, rust, hard water, things could accumulate. And if you get those down around the bottom of the cylinders, those areas won't want to cool either. Then the other thing that will hurt or slow heat transfer into the water is if you have air in the cooling system. In other words, if you have a head gasket bleeding gases into the cooling system, if it's foaming because you have contaminated coolant, if, there could be several things that would cause air in the system. So think about it as, I'm going to call it thermal resistance. You start with the heat gets into the metal. It's got to get from the metal into the water. Is anything slowing it down? It's got to get from the water. It's got to circulate, and it's got to get from the water through the radiator tubes out to the air. And that's the main thing. And anything that disrupts that process will cause you difficulties. So with that, I'm going to say let's dig in a little deeper and go through some of these elements a little closer. The first thing when you're dealing with the cooling systems are, first off is, do you have a cooling problem? How do you know, right? So, do you have a light on? Is your gauge high? What's your symptom? Is it boiling over on the ground, right? Those are the things you need to check. And temperature sending units are notoriously bad. They can drift. They're not a precision instrument. Dash gauges aren't a precision instrument. So the first thing to do is, if you've got a hot light or you've got a gauge, is check and see, is your gauge right? Is it really hot? You can use different thermometers. I'll tell you, and I know I'm plugging my own videos, but if you go look at my tool videos, I've got one for this infrared thermometer. IR gun, I like to call it, but it's an infrared thermometer. And while it's not perfect, you could come around here and, measure the top tank of the radiator where the upper hose goes in. Get a reading off the hose. These IR guns aren't perfect. They can have some inherent error in them. But when you have a nice flat black surface like a hose or engine block, or, they can be pretty doggone close. So check that out. You can even take your sending units out and test them. There are different things that you can do. Watch out when you're using scan tools. I'll tell you, the reason my Camaro boiled on the cam break-in, boil it right down, is I had a dash gauge and I had a scan tool. And the dash gauge was reading about 15 degrees higher than the scan tool. And I said, hey, the scan tool's a computer. I should believe that instead of the dash gauge. And by golly, the dash gauge was pretty darn close. And if I would have paid attention to that, and when it hit the red zone, if I'd have shut it down, I probably wouldn't have boiled over. But watch that. Oh, and before I leave that, with radiator caps, this car and many cars have a cap on the radiator that you can remove, and they have a pressure cap, and they have a vented coolant recovery bottle, and you can fill it the coolant recovery bottle. As time went on, there are also cars out there where the pressure cap is on the coolant recovery bottle, and my caution for safety is the same thing. You don't want to open those up hot, because if you take the pressure off the system, you'll be in trouble. You want to make sure that your system is full, that your coolant recovery bottle is at the right level. If you don't have a bottle, like my old Mustang, you got to make sure that the coolant is above the tubes in the radiator when it's cold. It's got to have some expansion room for when it gets hot. But there'll be an airspace in the tank because there isn't an overflow bottle at all. They just didn't run them that way. Then you get down into, I'm going to go ahead and say fans. What kind of fan do you have? The IROC has an electric fan. And if its thermostat isn't working right, you're going to run hot, especially running at low speeds. Other cars, and there may be some other third-gen Camaros, you'll have clutch-type fans. And in the clutch-type fans, you have viscous ones that run at a constant load all the time. and you have some that are thermostatic. My 428 Mustang has a thermostatic fan, and I had the thermostat go bad on it once, and I had to replace the fan clutch because it wasn't pulling enough air at low speed. So you got to make sure you got enough air, cooling air. You want to make also air dams. The Camaro is a classic case of this. There's an air dam down underneath the front fascia, and without that air dam, that air dam holds the air up, so as you're coming down the road, the air gets forced up and through the radiator, and there's a low pressure area on the back side, so that you bring air through the radiator. And if you take that air dam away, you're going to get hot. Next, is your radiator in good condition? In the old brass radiators, and in fact this Camaro, the book talks about it having an aluminum radiator, but it doesn't. The factory, this was one that still had a soldered brass, I'll say old school radiator in it. Those you got to watch out, because the solder, if your coolant has been depleted, the solder will corrode. And the old one that came out of here after 30 years, the white, you could look down in the tank, drain the tank, and you could look down with a flashlight, and the ends of all the tubes were white and crusty from the growth of corrosion on the lead solder. I'm not sure what the aluminum ones look like. I've never had an aluminum one corrode. You can have that as a the radiator issue. I had radiators back in the top flow days in my Mustangs. I had a core that expanded, probably somewhat due to the car, going around corners and racking it and so forth. But the fins, you got vertical tubes with fins in between, and the tubes in some cases were no longer touching the fins. If you looked really close, there was an air gap, and so the heat was going through the tubes, but it wasn't getting out to the air, and that engine would get pretty hot also, and the fix was a new radiator. If you had the one when I had a lot of corrosion, sometimes they can clean them and clean out the tubes. Mine was too far gone. They had to replace the core. It was, it got a brand new core. Good radiator shop took care of me, and it was fine. It's possible to get blockages. If you go reference the service manual, and I'll show you that in a minute, they talk about in the service manual checking for hot and cold spots in the radiator by touching it. Now I'll tell you, you go in this car, there's no way, it's got air conditioning, there's no way to get a hand in and touch that core. So that's a tough one. But, again, safety things, watching out about running engines and spinning belts and spinning fans. But another reason that I like this infrared gun is I've used them a lot for troubleshooting cooling systems and even radiators, because if you can get a spot where you can get a look at the core, you can measure the temperature at the inlet of the radiator, you can measure the temperature at the outlet, you can go down the core. If you can get, on this car, there's some places where you could get in around the fan, and you could get a look and see if you have consistency. Is the temperature from top to bottom all the same? On my 428 Mustang, it's pretty well open. You still got a fan, but I could get into the front, and I could go across and I could look at the temperature at the top, and I could look at the temperature at the bottom. I'm going to say, in principle, don't expect the radiator to make a lot of temperature change on a hot day, right? One of the things when I was going through with my Mustang, you measure the temperature coming out at the thermostat, you measure the temperature at the lower hose going back in, or at the bottom tank, so to speak, and see how much temperature the radiator's taken down. And then look at what's coming out of the engine again. The question is how much is the temperature gaining as it goes through the engine, and how much is the radiator taken back out? And on a hot day, the radiator might only take out 10 or 20 degrees. It isn't going to get you all the way back down to ambient, I'll call it. But the goal in life is for the radiator to take out so you can maintain a stable system. Again, you'll go into the book, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. I'll use the Camaro manual as a guide. There are a number of them out there, but if you're really in a tough one, I'd say get a good manual, even one of the third-party manuals, because they've got good thought provokers as you go through. You want to have good coolant in the block. You don't want air in the coolant. You don't want it aerated. Things that'll aerate it are like head gaskets, right? If you have a combustion leak into the coolant, that'll get you hot. And in the manual, there are some ways to test for that. You can have corrosion in the block. Now, in the service manual here, they don't talk about corrosion. On my Mustang, I've got a video where I was talking about pulling the drain plugs. The service manual for the Chevy says when you change coolant, pull the drain plugs like I recommended for the Mustang. I never used to do that, but I learned, right? You want to make sure that any sediments get out the bottom. And again, Chevy's talking about, in the service manual, they're really talking about new engines. If you have an old one, there are products on the market. Most of them have citric acid in them that you can use to clean sediments and flush. I used one Prestone one with the Mustang. It was put it in and drive it several hundred miles and then drain it. You got to do that in the summertime when it can't freeze. But I did, and every time I did it, I got more stuff out. Ultimately, in the end, I ended up looking for a stronger cleaner. There used to be strong cleaners that you could buy, and I used to use them back in the day, but you can't buy them anymore. They were oxalic acid and sodium carbonate, washing soda. You had an acid and you had a neutralizer. And I think they went away from them from a safety perspective, but they were really good at cleaning rust out. Well, safety and perhaps materials. Some of those acids were not good with aluminum radiators and so forth. So you won't find those on the market, but if you have patience, the Prestone ones will work. Prestone and other brands, but the citric acid flushes will, over time, they will take stuff out. You do always want to run 50-50, give or take, because you want corrosion protection in the block. So other than the time when you're flushing, once you get it out, 50-50 coolant, distilled or deionized water, and ethylene glycol, and try to get as close to a 50-50 mix as you can. Those are the things that come off the top of my mind. Going back to the statement about do you have a problem, my 428, I had a problem. Sort of. It didn't boil over. It never boiled over. And it's kind of a topic for another day, but in my old school cars that had a mechanical fan, that had a thermostatic clutch, I always expected on a 70-degree day the car ought to have enough cooling capacity at idle to idle on the thermostat, right? So it had a 190 thermostat, it ought to idle at 190. And if I idled for very long, it was idling 210, 220, 230 in traffic. On a 70 or 75 degree day. And that just didn't feel right. And then when I got into the garage and parked it, I had afterboil, right? I could hear it boiling, 5 or 10 minutes after you parked it, you could hear it gurgling and carrying on in the block. And then at about 2:30, the engine would start to stall at idle. It would, and again, topic for another day as to what the cause was for that. But it took me a couple of years of searching to understand why that was happening. Because the car never boiled over. I never got to 260. When it got to 230, it wasn't running right, and I didn't think it should run 230, so I fixed it. And part of the fixing it was a lot of flushing and cleaning and pulling the block drains and getting all the crud out. Those are some thoughts. Now I'm going to move over here. Now let's kind of add in what the service manual is looking at. And the first thing they caution you about is your radiator cap. And you want to make sure that it pressure and vents, and so there are recommendations that you should clean it and even pressure check it from time to time. Because it's always possible, if you're having a cooling system problem, especially a boiling problem, if your cap is not holding pressure, you'll have a problem. Here's their caution for, don't take off the pressure cap or you'll get yourself in trouble. The recommendation is to maintain at least a -34 freeze protection. You want to maintain that freeze protection for corrosion protection, and to make sure that your hot light works. If you don't keep enough coolant rich enough, close enough to 50-50, your temperature light or temperature gauge, you'll boil before you get to the warning levels, and you don't want that to happen. Cooling, draining, and refilling. So if you're going to drain and refill, see here it says close the drain the radiator and pull the block drains, open the block drains. Make sure the system is completely drained. Go ahead and refill it. Now, they'll tell you here is if you're losing coolant in particular, if you have small leaks, you can check for the leaks. So there's a check here for exhaust system leaks from a bad head gasket. Water pump. They talk about the water pump, and I'll tell you, for years and years and years, I'm sure they happen, but water pumps, other than the bearings failing, have never been a big issue to me. They claim you could have a plugged vent hole in the pump. I suppose that's possible. I won't rule it out. But I've never had a water pump that was so bad that it didn't pump enough coolant, that the veins were deteriorated or that it was plugged up. Here's the one I mentioned earlier, testing by warm the engine up, turn the engine off, and feel the radiator. Should be hot on the left and warm on the right with an even temperature rise. So that's where, if you can get to it with the infrared gun, it's a lot better than touching, and see where you're at. Here's one for testing the thermostat. I used to test thermostats back in the day, but frankly, it's like, for the few dollars that one costs, I just pitch it and put in a new one. Here's the overheating and/or noise. Engine that might make noises, gurgling, vibrating. See, here's the one where they say, feel the front of the radiator for cold spots. Well, inspecting the thermostat, thermostat housing, inspect the water. It's still not a bad idea to inspect the water pump. But I've had cars where I replaced the water pump, put a brand new one on, and I was still having a heating problem. So inspect the crossover. Here now they want to get serious. Remove the heads. Inspect all the coolant passages with the heads. See, this is one thing where I talked about my Mustang having too much corrosion. If you pulled the heads, you could go down and go into the block and look at the coolant passages and probably get a look down inside. But man, what a lot of work. This is the basic trouble tree that the Chevy guys give you. And this one says hot light or a high temperature gauge. Check your sending unit. If your sending unit's okay, then go to the section that says boiling or fix it. So here's boiling. Air dam, pressure cap, coolant level, hot light, is it working right? Antifreeze protection, sending unit, thermostat check. Now I'm going to go back on the thermostat check again. My handy dandy little infrared gun. You know, if I come over here, I have the thermostat neck here comes out of the engine and into this upper hose, and it feeds the radiator from there. And with this tool, you know, you get a spot on there, and gee, it says the hose is 93 degrees. Well, you should be able to tell, and even the aluminum, see, it says it's 93 or 95. So both of those agree pretty well. Start the car up, let it idle, see what temperature your thermostat cracks, because when the thermostat cracks, that hot coolant will come into this hose and you can measure it, and you can get a pretty good first approximation whether your thermostat's doing what it's supposed to do. You can measure both what's coming out, and you can go down and pick up that crossover passage where the thermostat housing bolts on and measure the temperature, you know, measure the temperature down there, which is the coolant that's feeding the thermostat. And so then on the Camaro, you know, this is for the IROC and the V8. So you got that, that's the hot side of your radiator. And you can come over here, and this is the cold side of your radiator, and the bottom hose will go back, so you can measure the temperature on that tank. And then the return hose, which is hard to see with all the belts in the way, but it goes back to the bottom of the water pump. That's your circulation. Let's see what else they give us here. Fan belt tension. You want to make sure your belts are tight enough, properly tensioned, so that the water pump and the fan, if it's driven by a belt, that you know that those are being driven properly. Oh, dirt, bugs, bent fins, anything blocking the radiator, or even the AC condenser. If the AC condenser gets plugged up, it will hurt the airflow going into your radiator. It's another one. So if none of them required repair, the problem's out of the ordinary or of a major nature. Whew. So then you got the major nature is to dig in. So here's going through coolant loss, leaks, foaming coolant, overflow, pressure checking the system to see if it holds pressure. And here's their suggestions. So problems not requiring major disassembly. Well, if you have anything that's blocking the radiator that's an accessory, ice, mud, snow, too much engine oil, wrong radiator, improper or missing air seals or baffles or air dam, ignition timing. If your engine's not performing right because the ignition timing is retarded, in particular, the engine will oftentimes run hot. There are some emission components that could give you trouble. Again, pressure checking for your defective water pump, plugged radiator tubes. That was my comment about corrosion on the tubes. Internal issues, head gaskets, crack block, intake manifold gaskets, well, leaking. Plugged coolant passages in the cylinder heads. Those are even tougher. Some of those things, again, it goes to can you clean it with a so here's one also, engine overheats, boiling, poor cooling. This is the one about checking your thermostat housing. And this is where I would use the infrared temperature probe instead of trying to get the melt stick that they're using. And again, these engines have a 195 or so thermostat, and that's probably fine. So this is one to check thermostat. This one is more for not enough heat. So I kind of go back to, over the years I've had engines with corroded radiators, with bad fins in the radiators. I even had one in the Mustang where I bought an aftermarket replacement radiator that was supposed to be really great and really cool, and it wasn't. You had to go in and count the number of fins per inch of radiator core, and the factory Ford radiator was 12 or 13 fins per inch, and this radiator was 8 or 9, and that didn't work either. I had to get that one replaced. I've had radiators that were plugged up. I had one car with the pulley was incorrect on the water pump, and it was running the wrong speed because it was an older car and somebody had swapped it and it was not the right pulley for the application. Thermostats. I've had trouble with thermostats where thermostats did not open when they were supposed to. They stuck closed. I had a car overheat and it damaged the thermostat, and I could drive about 6 or 8 miles and then it would boil again. I'd pour water in it and then I'd drive it about 6 or 8 miles and it would boil again. I was trying to get to a safe place off the highway. That one eventually, after a half a dozen or so of those incidents, that thermostat came apart and the engine actually ran quite a long time, but it was a twisted mass of metal when I got done. One thing guys do oftentimes is they want to put in a lower temperature thermostat. It's kind of like a big thing. Everybody goes, hey, put in a 180, put in a 160, it'll be better, it'll be better. Please don't. If you have a special need for a special thermostat, it's okay. And back in the day, we used to run 180s, and 180 was a good thermostat, it seemed. In the emissions world, it really turned out that a 190 or 195 was about right. It helps vaporize the fuel better, and some of us went, oh, it's too hot, but yeah, we've been doing it for 50 years now, and 195-ish works fine. If you have a heating problem where you're getting to 220, putting in a 160 thermostat isn't going to help you. It'll delay how long it takes to get to 220, but it's still going to get there. It'll open up as full as it can, but it won't fix it. People will pull out the thermostat and try to run without one. Don't do it. Bad idea. The thermostat is essentially an orifice. It helps control the flow rate through your cooling system. And there's actually an optimum flow rate. And the cooling systems are built around the idea that you have an orifice size. And if you take the thermostat out, I think you'll find there are people who make for racing applications and things where you don't necessarily want a thermostat, that will have an orifice, that's the right size to put in place of a thermostat. Some cars won't care, but most of them will. So make sure you have the right one. If you're on a modern car, and I say modern being, the IROC's that way, when you get into a car that has diagnostics on it, especially a car with OBD2, putting in a lower thermostat will mess you all up, because the diagnostics are looking for the coolant to get to a certain temperature, and if you put in a 180 or a 160, the car will never warm up to its full operating temperature, and the computer will start setting codes saying, hey, you never warmed up. So there you go. Everything interacts, I'll say, these days, and so you really have to watch and see, what makes it work right. And a lot of times things that are intuitively obvious aren't so good. So just be careful. I hope that's a good starting point. I'm afraid this has probably gotten too long, but cooling systems are complex animals, and a lot of times, you start with the basics. If I got airflow, is the radiator got flow, is my engine clean and got the right coolant in it, and is the thermostat working? Those are kind of like the big things. And beyond that, though, It's really hard to tell. If your engine's got scale on the block and it's not transferring heat from the water, from the metal into the water because there's layers of corrosion, that's hard to see from the outside. And so it takes a while. As I said, on some of my cars, using this little infrared thermometer, going around and taking spot temperatures while the engine is warming up and seeing where things are getting hot. Is the engine hot all the way across, on the heads, and the manifold is it the same temperature in the back as it is in the front? Sometimes if you got a tough one, sometimes making those kinds of checks will give you a clue. I'll just put it that way. So I hope it helps. If there's questions, I'll see what I can do to answer them. That's how I would approach it right now.
Hey, one more thing before I go. On the topic of these drain plugs, you recognize if you don't pull the drain plugs and remove them, the water pump isn't at the bottom of the block. You won't get all the water out of the block after you're done flushing. And if you've been flushing with a garden hose, you'll have tap water in the block where you'd really rather have a mix with deionized and or distilled water. And the tap water tends to cause scale, so it could be a longer term problem.
Yeah. That's all for now.